Welcome to Hidden Front History. Today, we're undertaking a deep dive into one of the most remarkable and frankly uncomfortable stories from the end of the Pacific War. It's a story that really changes how you define victory, and it explores the devastating psychological effects of mercy.
It's a complete paradox, both historically and psychologically. We're zeroing in on a single moment in time, September 12th, 1945.
Yeah.
So just weeks after the official surrender of Japan.
Right.
A transport ship is pulling into San Francisco Bay, and on board are 247 Japanese women. And we need to be clear, these were not frontline combat soldiers in the way we might think.
No, these were trained imperial personnel.
Exactly, highly trained. We're talking about nurses, radio operators, administrative clerks, mostly young women, between the ages of 18 and 30.
And the crucial part here, the part you have to understand from the very beginning, is that they are not arriving with any sense of relief. They are expecting absolute horror.
For years, the engine of imperial propaganda had just been relentless. It painted Americans as demons, as monsters, as savages, an enemy that would give no quarter.
So these women, they are fully 100% prepared for torture, for rape, for public execution. They sincerely believe that surrender means a fate far, far worse than the glorious death that their government had promised them.
They were psychologically armored,
Yeah.
Ready to endure any kind of violence. But what they got instead is what completely shattered their ideological defenses.
Isn't that violence?
Not at all. They were met with hot showers, fresh meals, clean sheets,
Right.
and dignity. And this deep dive is all about analyzing how that unexpected kindness acted as a more powerful psychological weapon than any bomb possibly could. It dismantled a lifetime of deeply held patriotic conviction.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're really exploring how an institutionalized, consistent ideology of human dignity, which was completely alien to them, managed to just erode the entire foundation of their worldview. An ideology built on sacrifice, on shame, and on unquestioning obedience. So our mission here is to understand that slow-motion collapse of their resistance. It demonstrates that the failure of the Japanese war machine, at least for these women, ultimately came not from cruelty, but from an act of mercy.
And before we really jump in, we should probably clarify one thing for you, the listener. When we talk about this humane treatment, we're talking about two very different forces colliding. Imperial propaganda on one side.
And international law on the other.
Precisely. When the women arrived, they heard the phrase, under the protection of the Geneva Convention.
Which meant absolutely nothing to them.
Right. It was a meaningless term they might have heard whispered. But for the U.S. military, adhering to the 1929 Geneva Convention was mandatory. It wasn't optional.
And that convention laid out specifics.
It did. It necessitated very specific standards of humane treatment. Adequate food, shelter, medical care, and humane quartering. It even mandated the separation of the sexes.
So the very rules that the Imperial Army routinely ignored or, actively violated.
Those were the exact rules the U.S. military was legally and ethically bound to provide to its enemies. So this wasn't necessarily, pure altruistic charity. It was institutional compliance. And that institutional commitment to rules that protect human dignity, that was the first crack in the Japanese ideological armor.
So let's start with the arrival itself. The scene is just so critical for understanding the emotional shift that's about to happen. It's September. The San Francisco fog is hanging heavy and cold over the bay.
You can just picture it. The women were exhausted, their uniforms were patched and filthy, and the source material describes the transport ship groaning beneath them, sounding like a creature nearing death. The atmosphere was just thick with dread.
The fear was absolute.
It was. We have internal accounts, diaries from several women, including a 22-year-old nurse from Osaka named Ko. She recounted whispering to her friend Yuki, who was a radio operator, "They will kill us when we land."
And that wasn't an exaggeration. That was her genuine belief.
It was her certainty. And Yuki, who was known for her composure, she admitted later she was physically paralyzed by terror. She just stared ahead, jaw clenched, unable to speak, just waiting for the horror that her leaders had promised her was coming.
And then through this curtain of mist and dread comes this impossible vision.
Right. As the ship gets closer to the American shore, the monumental arches of the Golden Gate Bridge start to emerge from the fog.
And it was completely untouched.
Utterly untouched. Perfect.
Yeah.
It spanned the water like this immense, silent, golden challenge. For these women, who are coming from a country where nearly every major city was just ash and rubble, where bridges were strategic targets and therefore gone.
To see that, the intact, majestic power of that bridge, it must have been just terrifying.
It was a symbol of the overwhelming, undamaged power of the enemy. It was the first visual cue that the war they had been fighting was so much bigger and their defeat so much more complete than they had ever been allowed to imagine.
So when they finally dock at the military pier, the terror doesn't go away. It changes form. They're expecting machine guns, barking commands, snarling faces.
And instead, they see dozens of American soldiers just standing around in these loose, almost casual formations. They're
Mm.
talking to each other, smoking cigarettes. They're completely relaxed.
There's no menace.
None at all. They aren't shouting or pointing their weapons aggressively. And then one soldier, completely oblivious to the terror he was causing, he offers this casual, almost friendly gesture up toward the ship's deck. Just a small wave.
I can't even imagine the confusion.
Well, Kaderi later confessed that she grabbed Yuki's arm and asked if she saw it, if she saw the wave. She was wondering if it was some kind of dark, elaborate trick, to disarm them before the abuse began. The complete absence of aggression was the first active psychological attack.
And that confusion just deepens when the gangway lowers. A Japanese-American translator steps forward and delivers that alien concept.
You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. Again, most of the women had no frame of reference for this. They started moving reluctantly down the ramp, just convinced that any second the facade would break and the violence would start.
So the very instant Ka's foot touches American soil, she braces herself.
She does, but the soldier she passes just smiles. And the source notes here are so important. It wasn't a mocking, cruel smirk. It was a genuine, non-threatening, gentle expression. It was, and this is a quote, somehow more terrifying than any weapon.
Because she was prepared for pain, but she had no defense against a smile.
Not at all. So they're led into this large white building, a processing center. And the air inside smelled of two things that were completely contradictory. First, this sharp, clean disinfectant smell.
Okay.
And then underneath that, this subtle, strange, floral scent they couldn't quite place. And here's the first real structural surprise. The personnel processing them are female American nurses. Uniformed, crisp, and calm.
American women.
American women treating them. It immediately contradicted the dehumanization they were expecting. And then came the order. Remove your uniforms for medical checks and a shower.
And that would have been a moment of pure panic.
Absolute panic. In Japanese culture, especially for women of that time, modesty was everything. To undress in front of strangers, let alone the enemy, was a humiliation designed to strip them of their identity and dignity. Ko's face was burning with profound shame.
You can just feel the tension in that room.
But the American nurses, the sources repeatedly described them as moving with gentle efficiency. There was no judgment, no mockery. It was just a quiet, professional task. One nurse noticed Ko's hands were shaking uncontrollably, and she just placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "It's okay."
And Ko wouldn't have understood the English.
No, but she understood the tone, the simple human empathy, and that's when she finally broke. She just burst into tears.
And then came the showers.
The ultimate sensory shock. It was a large, tiled room filled with steam and a sense of cleanliness they hadn't known in years. Yuki turns on the faucet, and she actually gasps. The water was hot, not just lukewarm, which would have been a luxury in the field, but truly steaming hot water. And it was abundant, endless.
Was soap.
Oh, the soap. The white bars were smooth and heavy. The women were holding them, turning them over, just absorbing the sight and the scent. That floral smell they couldn't place earlier.
It was soap.
It was the soap. It smelled like flowers, like lilacs in spring, like a world that hadn't been destroyed by war. That sensory detail is everything. It wasn't just physical cleaning. It was a psychological connection to a peacetime existence they'd been taught was lost forever.
The release must have been immense.
It was intense and chaotic. Women started to cry, some laughed hysterically, others just stood frozen under the water, washing away months of dirt, exhaustion, and most critically, fear. Ko scrubbed her skin until it was painful. She washed her hair 3 times. She was trying to scrub away the identity of the starving, defeated souls.
And returned to who she was before the war.
Exactly. When they emerged, they were given clean undergarments, simple, soft gray dresses, and new, soft cotton socks. Tomoko, one of the older women, she caught her reflection in a small piece of glass. She touched her face, whispering, "I forgot I could look like this."
But right there, that's the central conflict. Beneath that profound physical relief, there's shame, there's confusion. They were supposed to be paying for their country's defeat with suffering.
Right. And instead they'd been given dignity, cleanliness, and comfort. What kind of enemy, they started asking themselves, operates by restoring your humanity?
That question, what kind of enemy, that becomes the central theme for the next few weeks, doesn't it? The initial shock of arrival lasts for a few days. But what happens when that kindness is sustained over weeks? When does that relief start to turn into an unbearable guilt?
That's when the next psychological weapon is deployed.
Yeah.
The shock of sustained abundance.
The mess.
It's the mess hall. They were led into this huge room, long tables covered in clean white cloths. But the overwhelming experience was the smell. The rich aroma of bread baking, savory meat cooking, coffee brewing, butter melting. It was a sensory assault of prosperity that was just completely alien to them.
They must have thought it was a trick or that it was poisoned.
They sat rigidly, absolutely fearing that. Then the plates arrived, and Ko just stared down at a portion of food she genuinely hadn't seen on a single plate in 3 years of total war.
What was on the plate?
Roast chicken, golden and glistening, mashed potatoes piled high with a thick pool of brown gravy, green beans, thick slices of white bread with generous yellow butter, a glass of cold milk, and steaming coffee.
The details there are just incredible. The fat on the chicken.
A sign of unbelievable, wasteful abundance to them. The cold milk, which requires consistent refrigeration and supply chains their country hadn't had for years. The savory, rich taste of the gravy, it was just too much.
Who was the first to break?
Yuki. She lifts her fork, and the taste of this rich, savory, real food just explodes on her tongue. She closes her eyes, and then she starts to cry. And that was the trigger. Other women began eating frantically, just sobbing into their food or laughing hysterically. They couldn't process the relief against the reality of their situation.
And this is the moment that guilt hammer, as the source calls it, drops.
It's the exact moment. The second the food satisfies their immediate physical needs, it activates the deepest, most profound shame. Tomoko, holding a large piece of chicken, cries out loud, "My children are starving in Tokyo and I'm eating chicken."
That's devastating. The implication is instantaneous. The American enemy is feeding them better, far better than their own country had managed, even before the war had truly ended.
The hunger was so deeply ingrained that it just compelled them to eat, but the shame of consuming that abundance while their families were starving. One woman wrote it was a physical weight. They were failing to fulfill the gammon, the Japanese imperative of stoic endurance and suffering.
After the meal, they're led to the barracks.
Simple white wooden buildings. But inside were rows of actual beds, metal frames, mattresses, pillows, and thick wool blankets, essential for the California winter that was coming. Tomoko just sat on the edge of her bed, tracing the thick weave of the blanket. She whispered, "This is wrong. We're supposed to pay for what our country did. Instead, they treat us like human beings."
So the torture then becomes the routine, the surreal ordinariness of it all.
Exactly. A bell would ring at 6:30, and the women, just out of ingrained military habit, would make their beds with rigid precision. Breakfast was at 7:00, and it was the same relentless display of abundance. Oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins.
Sugar?
Right. Scrambled eggs, toast, jam, fresh fruit, apples, bananas, milk, and coffee every single morning. This endless, effortless prosperity broke them more than any rationing ever could have.
And the work they were assigned.
It was intentionally light, almost gentle. It was designed to keep them occupied, but not strained. Again, adhering to the Geneva requirements. They were expecting back-breaking labor. They got laundry facilities with large mechanical washers. They helped in the kitchen. Some did light translation duties.
Ko, the nurse, she was assigned to the camp hospital.
And this was critical. She was working alongside American nurses Helen and Margaret. And they treated her not as an enemy who needed to be supervised, but as a colleague. They needed her professional skills.
They valued her for what she could do.
Yes. Helen, specifically, would take time to teach Ko new medical terms, explain how their modern equipment worked. It was a validation of Ko's individual worth, completely separate from her nationality.
And then there was the financial aspect. They were paid.
They were. They were paid in camp script every Friday, a kind of token currency that was only valid inside the camp. And they could visit the canteen. And this wasn't just a place for survival necessities. It was an archive of impossible luxuries.
Like what?
Hershey's, Baby Ruth, chocolate bars, lipstick, hand lotion, small bottles of perfume. These were items that made life more than just mere survival. They were symbols of a frivolous peacetime consumerism that was totally absent from wartime Japan.
What do they do with that first payment?
Yuki, on her first visit, bought chocolate. She carried it back to the barracks like it was a religious relic. She broke it off square by square, savoring the intense sweetness, and she whispered to Ko, "I'm eating chocolate. We're prisoners of war, and I'm eating chocolate." The routine of daily sustained comfort was, in fact, a sustained psychological attack designed to normalize dignity.
As the weeks turned into months, you start to see this strange disconnect emerge. Physically, the women are getting stronger.
Oh, absolutely. Color returns to their cheeks, they're gaining necessary weight, their exhaustion is fading.
Oh.
But as their physical health improved, their mental and emotional turmoil it skyrocketed. Every day of conflict was a day of profound guilt. Every meal felt like a betrayal of their suffering homeland.
And that internal torment was then sharpened to a fine point by the arrival of letters from home.
This is what the source material emphasizes as the true knife to the heart. These thin, worn letters arriving, often in shaky handwriting, confirming the utter systemic devastation that they had only dared to imagine.
Ko's first letter.
It arrived in late October. Her mother described Tokyo being reduced to rubble and the grim reality of daily life, eating only rice water and cabbage leaves once a day. And the most painful part, she mentioned Ko's little brother was getting thinner each week, constantly asking for the sweets Ko used to bring him.
Oh, that's brutal.
And the mother wrote, hoping Ko was being treated fairly, maybe with a touch of desperation, just hoping she wasn't suffering too much.
The cognitive dissonance there must have been immediate and violent.
Ko couldn't eat dinner that night. She just stared at her plate. It was roast beef and carrots, and all she could see was the transparent, gaunt face of her little brother superimposed over the food. She pushed the plate away. She couldn't reconcile the endless, savory food on her plate with the starvation described on that single piece of worn paper.
And other women were getting the same kind of news.
The same. Desperate reports of malnutrition, homelessness, death. The juxtaposition was simply unbearable. Inside the camp, they were fed, clothed, and protected under law. But then, during occasional supervised work details, they'd catch glimpses of nearby American towns.
And life was just normal.
Exactly. Stores were full of goods. Children were playing in parks. Life was continuing normal and untouched, as if the entire war had been a distant rumor. This visible, thriving contrast was psychologically crushing.
And it's these small, accidental acts of decency that really start to break through the armor of propaganda.
Yes. Let's go back to Yuki. She's working in a field one afternoon. She's watching the American guard, who is supervising them, open his metal lunchbox. He pauses, looks at the women, and then, just casually, without any fanfare, he shares his wife's homemade ham and cheese sandwiches with them.
Why?
Through the translator, he just explained that his wife had made extra because she knew, you girls are hungry.
So a woman Yuki had never met, whose country had defeated hers, had sent food just because
she perceived them as hungry human beings. Yuki took the sandwich, bowed deeply, and tears were just streaming down her face.
And that night, her journal entry, it really captures the psychological break.
It does, she wrote. How am I supposed to hate people like this? How am I supposed to remain loyal to an empire that let me starve while the enemy feeds me? The kindness didn't just negate the required hatred, it inverted the entire concept of loyalty. It redirected her anger toward her own failing state.
And the final piece of this internal torment was what one source calls the shame of wellness.
Yes. Tomoko is standing in the washroom mirror one morning in November, and she realizes she looks healthy, fed, like I did before the war. She had flesh on her bones, her skin was clear, her eyes were bright. The guilt of achieving personal health while her children had gaunt faces in Tokyo was absolutely crushing.
It raises a really powerful question. Was this treatment purely a function of legal obligation, or was there an element of calculated strategic messaging intended for the Japanese population during the early occupation?
That is an excellent question that historians still debate. On the one hand, the Geneva Convention was the stated legal reason. But on the other, the consistent, non-vindictive application of that kindness served a massive strategic purpose.
How so?
It immediately and completely disproved the entire platform of imperial propaganda. The U.S. knew that these POWs would eventually return home, and the accounts of their treatment would be powerful propaganda against the previous regime.
So by showing dignity,
the U.S. was investing in long-term geopolitical stability. It was subtly communicating to the defeated populace, we are not the monsters you were told we were. Your leaders lied to you. The psychological torture was successful precisely because it was strategically sound. It exposed the lie by providing the absolute opposite of what they were expecting.
So if the feast and the letters provided the initial shock and guilt, it was the continuous, almost mundane succession of these casual kindnesses that made no sense, that systematically wore down their resistance.
Yay. These small acts were strategically irrelevant on a macro scale, but they were psychologically devastating on an individual level
Yeah.
because they just chipped away at that deeply ingrained notion of the enemy as this singular malicious force.
Let's talk about a couple of those crucial breaking moments. The first one involves Ko in the hospital.
Right. She's carrying this towering stack of folded white linens and she trips, scatters them everywhere. She immediately drops to her knees, face burning with shame, just bracing herself for the inevitable sharp rebuke, the harsh punishment that would have absolutely followed this kind of negligence in the Imperial Army.
But that's not what happens.
Not at all. Instead, she hears this warm, gentle laughter. Captain Miller, one of the American doctors, he doesn't chastise her. He immediately kneels down to help gather the scattered sheets. He's not annoyed, he's not inconvenienced, he just smiles and says, happens to everyone, and even gives her this light mock salute before walking away.
And Ko is just paralyzed.
Utterly paralyzed. She can't comprehend an American officer, a figure of authority and power, kneeling to help an enemy prisoner pick up laundry. It defied every rule of power, hierarchy, and conduct she had ever known.
And the second anecdote, it involves Yuki and music.
Yes. She's standing near an American barracks when she hears this bright, swinging music coming from an open window. An American soldier sees her, waves her closer, and after a brief exchange through gestures, asks if she likes music. He comes back a few minutes later with a vinyl record,
A Glenn Miller record.
a Glenn Miller Orchestra recording. A puricento, he called it. A gift. He insisted she take it for the women in her barracks. That night, this loud, brassy, thoroughly American music filled the Japanese barracks.
How did the other women react?
Some still frowned. They couldn't bring themselves to enjoy the music of their conquerors, but many others closed their eyes and just subtly swayed to the rhythm. The ideological lines were blurring. Music was just music, regardless of where it came from. The American humanity, delivered through these small, utterly optional acts, was becoming inescapable.
But the true turning point, the thing that connects these small acts of kindness back to the systemic betrayal by their own state, it came with the weather.
It did. The first cold snap hit California in November. The women woke up shivering, huddling under their thin blankets, just dreading the impending cold winter.
And then at breakfast, there's an announcement.
A simple, almost bureaucratic announcement from the camp commander. He just states that they'd noticed the drop in temperature and had ordered additional wool blankets and warm coats for all prisoners. And they'd increased the coal allocation for the barracks stoves.
And there was no fanfare?
No fanfare, no expectation of gratitude, just a statement of fact. Stay warm.
And for Tomoko, that was a defining moment.
It was. She was able to mentally compare this simple act of enemy decency, the system just noticing they were cold and providing warmth to the reality back home in Hiroshima. Her own family was forced to burn irreplaceable furniture just to stay warm because the military had requisitioned every lump of coal.
The realization must have been crushing.
It was a profound realization. Her own government saw them as resources, to be used and discarded. The enemy saw them as human beings who needed warmth and protection from the elements. That cognitive dissonance was no longer bearable. It was a devastating indictment of imperial ideology.
And so, with these events, the internal war that had been suppressed by fear and military discipline, it just explodes into open debate in the barracks after lights out.
Yes, and these arguments were critical. This was the women actively dismantling the propaganda, brick by ideological brick, with each other.
You had the hardliner, Fumito.
Fumiko. She insisted that all of it, the food, the blankets, the mock salute, it was all political theater. She argued that the Americans were trying to break their spirit not through violence, but through comfort, trying to make them psychologically complicit in their own defeat by accepting the enemy's charity. She demanded they maintain their dignity.
But Yuki challenged her.
Directly. Bitter from her experience with the sandwich, she shot back. We were sent to war by men who promised us glory and gave us starvation and defeat. And now the enemy feeds us, clothes us, treats us like human beings, and we're supposed to feel ashamed of that? I'm done being ashamed. Her argument shifted the focus from the enemy's actions to Japan's failures.
And then Sachiko, the 19-year-old clerk, she adds her own insight.
A very specific one. She stated plainly that she saw more casual respect and less arbitrary violence from these American guards than she ever saw in the Imperial Army. She told stories of officers beating soldiers for minor infractions, commanders sending men to certain pointless death and calling it glory. She concluded, This treatment is not weakness, Fumiko. It's something else.
Tomoko tries to put a name to it. Democracy.
Right. She suggests it might be democracy, this idea that people can question authority, that leaders are supposed to serve the populace, not the other way around. But Fumiko immediately counters with the stark contradiction.
The atomic bombs.
Democracy didn't stop the atomic bombs. The same country that is giving us chocolate is the country that unleashed destruction on an unthinkable scale. How can both things be true in one nation?
And that leads to this chilling synthesis of the whole debate delivered by Yuki.
Yes. She argues that the true terrifying strength of the Americans was in their ability to do both. To destroy their enemies completely and then treat the survivors with institutional, systematic mercy afterward. That's strength, she realized. Terrifying strength. The ideology they were fighting was one that could afford to be utterly ruthless in war and profoundly humane in victory. It was a complete philosophical checkmate.
This ideological crucible culminates in the final event of the year, the Christmas celebration.
Right. Late December. The women watch the Americans decorate a tree with lights and ornaments, a ritual that's completely foreign to them, but also profoundly domestic and peaceful. And they're invited to a party with special food, music, and most incredibly personal gifts.
Each woman gets a small, wrapped package.
The contents were simple. A new bar of soap, a comb, a small mirror, and a chocolate bar. But the items were wrapped as if they were precious, tied with ribbons, placed individually.
And for Ko, this is the moment of epiphany.
It solidifies the breakdown. She finally understood that this was not a calculated transaction designed to buy their loyalty. It was simply how these people behaved. This was the dangerous truth that shattered the remaining propaganda. American institutional power came from the underlying philosophy that human dignity existed regardless of nationality, regardless of war. Victory did not require vengeance.
Tomoko, realizing the magnitude of this moral statement, she stands up and bows deeply to the camp commander.
She does, and she tells him, "You have shown us something different, something we don't fully understand yet." And the commander, he's visibly embarrassed by this profound gratitude. He just insists he was just following the rules of the Geneva Convention.
But they knew better.
The women knew the choice to show mercy when they could have easily chosen vengeance was the entire point. The most devastating weapon America deployed was not technological. It was the simple, radical, and institutionally enforced idea that every individual human life had value, transcending national boundaries.
But January 1946, the internal resistance it's gone. It's utterly exhausted. They can't maintain the required hatred when the demons are giving them wrapped Christmas presents and warm coats.
The psychological collapse was complete. But it's important to note, it wasn't a collapse into despair. It was a collapse into a painful but ultimately liberating truth.
And this all comes to a head in the story of Ko, the nurse.
It does. A definitive peak. She's working in the hospital, and she catches her reflection in a glass cabinet door, and she just stops, stares intensely at her own image. The woman looking back at her has round cheeks, clear skin, bright eyes, a composure she hadn't possessed in years. She looked younger, healthier, better than she did even before the war started.
And the realization hits her like a physical blow.
The full, devastating weight of betrayal. The enemy had, in effect, restored her to herself. Her own country, Japan, had demanded her sacrifice, had starved her, and had given her propaganda instead of food, lies instead of dignity.
Japan had valued her as a tool. America, the enemy, valued her as a human being.
Exactly. She realized the years of suffering, the intense hunger, the devotion to a state that fundamentally did not care for its people. It was all built on a massive lie. Koja slides down the wall to the floor, collapsing in these deep, wrenching sobs. She's grieving not just the defeat, but the girl she had been who believed the propaganda. Grieving for the years wasted serving a cause that never valued her humanity.
And it's how this breakdown is handled that's so significant. Nurse Helen finds her.
Yes, the American woman who had every reason to feel resentment toward a defeated enemy, she just sits down on the floor beside her. She doesn't offer a platitude, she doesn't try to fix it, she just sits with her in silence, offering comfort without judgment.
And she says something to her.
She does. She repeats the phrase, even though Ko barely understood the English. It's okay to feel betrayed, you were lied to. That singular act of recognition, of empathy from the supposed enemy, completely shatters the last remaining fragment of Ko's old worldview.
And Ko rises from that moment transformed.
Completely. That evening, he stands up and delivers her devastating truth to the women in the barracks. She speaks quietly, but her words are steady and undeniable. I look better now as a prisoner than I ever did as a free citizen of Japan. Japan failed us completely and utterly failed us. This painful realization that the enemy had treated them like human beings, proving their own country never truly had, it breaks the remaining collective resistance.
The resistance washes away. But as winter turns to spring and rumors of repatriation start to circulate for April 1946, the women don't feel joy, they feel dread.
Profound dread. Ko lay awake worrying about returning healthy and well-fed to her starving family. The guilt was already creeping back in.
And Yuki confesses the unspeakable truth to her.
She does. She says, "I'm afraid to go back." And this is the final tragic paradox of the whole story. The women were admitting they preferred American captivity, which provided guaranteed human dignity and physical sustenance, to freedom in a devastated Japan, which provided chaos, hunger, and proof of their nation's abandonment.
They actually asked to stay.
They did. They began tentatively asking the American officers if they could stay in California, but they were gently denied. The Geneva Convention was strict. It required immediate repatriation upon the cessation of hostilities.
So they sail back across the Pacific, and the contrast between the two arrivals is just staggering.
They first see the Japanese coast, not as a site of home, but as a landscape of absolute devastation. Cities reduced to ash, harbors filled with sunken vessels, and the silent, terrifying space where Hiroshima once stood.
When they dock at Yokohama, they face the full reality.
The full, crushing reality. Skeletal buildings, people in rags, children with distended bellies begging for food. It made the guilt they had felt in the camp feel trivial in comparison.
Ko finds her family.
She does, in a makeshift shelter. Her mother's initial joy quickly turns into a look of confusion and then quiet accusation.
You look well.
Her mother said it carefully. That simple phrase, "you look well," carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. The guilt Ko felt was, in her own words, nothing compared to what she felt now. She was a survivor, but her survival was a living, breathing testament to the profound failure of her nation and the unexpected mercy of her enemy.
So what happened to these women? They eventually scattered across a rebuilding Japan.
They did. And they rarely spoke publicly about their time as prisoners. It was too complex, too painful, too contradictory. But they were fundamentally, irrevocably changed. The experience in that camp planted these scattered seeds of new thought that grew into different philosophies for the next generation.
Ko, the nurse.
Inspired profoundly by her time in the camp hospital and the professionalism of Helen, she became a nurse. In the 1960s, she opened her own clinic in Tokyo, and she consciously structured it on the philosophy of universal dignity and care she learned in captivity. She made sure her clinic never turned anyone away based on their status or nationality. She prioritized the individual over any kind of institutional pride.
And Yuki.
Yuki, unable to fully reconcile with the lie of the imperial state, eventually married an American soldier during the occupation. She moved to California and raised bicultural children. For her, personal connection, kindness, and love became more important than any abstract national pride or ideology.
And Tomoko, she became a teacher.
She returned to her children and spent her life not preaching hatred or loyalty, but teaching the next generation to be critical thinkers. She taught them to question authority, to recognize propaganda, and to understand that their worth didn't come from their service to the state, but from their own inherent humanity.
So in the end, the simplest items, that white bar of floral soap, the chocolate, the wool blankets, they became symbols of the most devastating weapon America possessed.
It wasn't the atomic bomb. It was the simple, difficult, and profoundly effective belief that every human life had value, even enemy lives. That ideology proved far more resilient and far more destructive to the imperial worldview than any physical force could have been.
They learned that the real battlefield they had fought on wasn't between Japan and America. It was between ideologies. One that demanded complete obedience and saw humans as tools for the state.
And one that enforced, even on its enemies, the idea of the individual as being worth protecting. The enemy's radical mercy made them question everything they believed, and it led them to a painful but ultimately liberating truth about their own value.
This story really provides a powerful challenge to how we think about conflict resolution and even strength itself. It asks you to look beyond the immediate violence of war and recognize the long-term ideological consequences of choosing institutionalized mercy over vengeance. You often hear the cliché that war is hell and that cruelty is an inevitable part of conflict. But this story suggests that sometimes the hardest and most effective weapon for a dedicated enemy to carry is not hatred, but kindness. If a country can effectively break the spirit and ideological foundation of its enemies, not through force and deprivation, but through systematic dignity and humane treatment, what does that imply about the kind of strength truly required to build a lasting peace? That is something for you to consider long after this deep dive ends.